Agnieszka, welcome to the Birchal Podcast. It's a pleasure to have you with us. Thank you so much for coming in, taking the time out of your day to come and talk to us about all things psychedelics. Now, psychedelics, for those who don't know, are a very interesting space. It's quite a controversial topic. We'll say that at the top, straight off the bat. It's also a sector which is growing like crazy. So if you read some of the news articles, it's $1 billion industry in the US already, and it's projected to, I think, grow at 13.5% over the next 10 or so years, every year, so compound annual growth rate. So a significant sector, and one which is there's a growing movement here in Australia. Matt, the founder of Birchal, he's very passionate about this space, and I'm really, really excited to have you here to talk about all things psychedelic. So first of all, welcome. How are you?
Thank you so much for having me. Very excited. And thank you for nailing my name as well.
Okay, well, I've only aimed for the first bit, as in the Agnieszka part, and the surname, I'm still a bit tentative. Sekula? Sekula. Okay, there we go. We'll move on promptly. But thank you for being so polite about it. So Enosis Therapeutics is the company that you run.
That's it.
With your co-founder, Dr. Prash, who I think some may well know. Tell us in your own words, what's the point of Enosis?
That's a tricky question that everyone expects me to answer in a single sentence. So I could give you the investor spiel, which is that Enosis is a psychedelic startup, or it is a medtech company that is aiming to introduce virtual reality into mental health to scale mental health treatments. Or it is a research and development company that is looking into maximizing the outcomes of psychedelic treatments by introducing technology into it. These are all very reductive in a way that anyone who tries to explain to anyone else what a psychedelic experience is would have to really limit what that experience truly feels like. You can't put that into words just as much as you can't really explain what virtual reality is. In the same way, you can't really explain what Enosis is, which is only by trying it you can actually get what the experience is like. This is something that psychedelics, VR, and Enosis have in common, and you can immediately understand the power of it, the benefit of it, once you've actually go through the experience, but it's almost impossible to put that into words.
I'm a complete amateur in this space, like no idea. I didn't grow up with a lot of exposure to, let's say, illicit drugs, smoking. I tried, did for a bit, but then pretty much stopped. So this whole world seems very foreign to me. So let's just start with the real basics for the people who are listening. Psychedelics, what do you mean by psychedelics?
Yeah, psychedelics, very, very interesting compounds. I'm not going to get into the physiology of that. What we will focus on is the experiential aspect of psychedelics, because that's really the most exciting thing about psychedelics.
Right.
If you think about any other drug, let's say, there isn't as many use cases for any other substance in medicine as there is for psychedelics. You don't hear of people taking antidepressants to go to a festival or taking cocaine to go and see their therapist. Yet psychedelics are used across all of those use cases. Granted, the most common use is still recreational, but any population study will show that psychedelics are used by between 10 to 40% of any given population for psychological benefits, or a similar percentage is also true for spiritual benefits. So if you think about it, a large majority of people are using psychedelics in a very intentional way. What makes them so special in that way, and what makes them so applicable to so many different use cases? And that is the experience. What that experience is like, and how profound it feels like, how rich it feels like, and how personally meaningful that experience is. We don't really know what the nature of the experience is completely. So this is because the experience itself is so complex and so personal. So obviously it's very difficult to communicate that to another human being of what that experience is for you. And also because there really isn't enough research in this space yet. So there is a lot of research in terms of the medical benefits of psychedelics. But truly, when we look at the qualitative aspects of the experience itself, which is that very elusive part of what psychedelics are, there really isn't enough data to understand how people go through the experience, how people use that experience for their own benefits, and how they even go through the process of healing with the use of the psychedelic compounds within the medical system. One thing that is happening is that we can all acknowledge that psychedelics are a part of the procedure when they're used within the medical system. And it is... sorry, I might need to take a breath here.
No worries.
Cut that out. So one thing that we can agree on is that psychedelics are used as part of the procedure within the medical system, which means that they're not just being delivered by a doctor and then taken home and taken at home by the patient alone. They are being delivered as part of what is called a psychedelic-assisted psychotherapy. So if you think about that, it's actually the psychotherapy that is the key component there, and psychedelics are only facilitating that, only assisting with the process,
right. Which
means that there's something more than just the physiological aspects of the experience that is of importance to the healing process. And that's what is of such big interest to us at Enosis, which are those experiential moments in psychedelic-based treatments that are then utilized for personalized healing.
To catch people up, psychedelics are already being used in certain test cases right now, as I understand it.
That's right.
So what are the medical... and that's under they're genuinely allowed to use. I think PTSD, as if I'm not mistaken, is one of them. What are the others that are kind of actually practical use right now?
That's right. So that's a very recent thing that just happened in Australia, and Australia is kind of pioneering and trailblazing this path.
Interesting.
So TGA has accepted medical use of psychedelics within very specific cases, and that is still up to a psychiatrist to go through a quite complex process of gaining an approval for every individual patient. And this exists within the treatment-resistant depression with the use of psilocybin, and for PTSD with the use of MDMA. So these are the most strongly researched use cases for those specific compounds. But within the research space, there's a whole range of different indications, and that is again something that is so fascinating about psychedelics, because within most psychoactive compounds, you only have a few use cases where it's truly showing results. For psychedelics, there is a whole range of cases that are being studied, from addiction to eating disorders to any trauma or anxiety-related disorders. And there seems to be a benefit of using psychedelics for every single one of them.
Wow, fascinating. So, yeah, right. I'm just trying to get my head around this whole space as a newbie in this area. So the test case for psychedelics is really broad by the sounds of things, right? There's lots of opportunity in that space. I'm intrigued, why have you gone down the VR side of things?
Yeah, so that comes back to those experiential moments in treatment that are of such big importance to psychedelic-based approaches. The experience itself is what's being utilized in the treatment, and that's why it's so broadly applicable to so many different conditions. It's because there is a whole range of insights that patients glean from the experience as they go through that whole process, which are about themselves, about the world they live in, about their relationships. The insights are quite broadly applicable to basically just anyone, which is why there's a lot of doctors and a lot of people who advocate for psychedelics being used, not just for patients, but just for anyone, because we would all benefit from having those kind of insights that basically make our life better. And that's what's so unique about the psychedelic experience. You go through something that feels very profound, very true, very real, even though it is a mystical experience and it's perceptually very different to what you're used to. It can be very challenging, very destabilizing. You can have the type of emotions that you're not used to, or the emotions that are associated with thoughts that don't normally come together. So there is this almost new discovery of who you are and how you're perceiving the world that happens with psychedelics. And that's why this is something that can be utilized across different indications and can be basically leveraged to benefit basically just anyone. And so the reason we
Can I just jump in there, Agnieszka? So I just want to understand. So, for example, PTSD treatment. it's under a psychiatrist, you said, and they're using, what was the compound?
So it's MDMA.
MDMA.
Or PTSD.
So in that space, they're being put through some sort of treatment to kind of navigate the PTSD, to maybe even revisit it. Is that right, to kind of unpack it? How are they using the psychedelics in that context currently?
Yeah, so there are a few components to that. Firstly, there is the preparation process where patients go through a little bit of unpacking of what is it that they would like to address. They set an intention quite often for their treatment. So what are the main things they would like to be experiencing, or what are the main things that they would like to process during the experience? And that prepares them for the dosing session, which is the psychedelic experience. During the psychedelic experience, what normally happens is that kind of all the emotional constraints break loose in a way. So there is that's why I said it can be very challenging and very destabilizing, because you do feel a lot. It's not an easy experience, but those feelings come with a larger perspective on them, if that makes sense. So that's the best way I can put that, is that patients often do revisit the traumas that they've experienced in the past, but it is with just a little bit more of a distance towards the trauma, or they can process it differently emotionally. So it could be compared a little bit to exposure therapy, but in a way that is more internally processed. And that is why it feels so profound, because they are going through that, they're re-experiencing certain elements of it. Maybe they see the traumatic experience in a different light. Or maybe this is the first time that they can actually speak about this openly. Some patients can't have a conversation about their traumatic experience without a state of panic. And that kind of emotional distance that psychedelics allow means that they might be, for the first time, able to put that into words or express somehow the experience that they're processing. So there's a whole range of different pathways that are used to explain why the experience itself is beneficial. These are just some of those examples.
Your VR, virtual reality, is the term we're referring to. How does that benefit, improve, clarify, whatever? What's the thing you're aiming to achieve in that context?
So the VR component comes on the other side of the experience. Right. I spoke about the preparation and
so
about the dosing.
So it's not during, it's not making it like a deeper trip, as it were?
No, not at all. I mentioned preparation, I mentioned dosing, and after the dosing session, there is an integration process. Right. So this is when all those insights that I mentioned are being integrated into the therapeutic approach and integrated into more holistically into patient's life. There is a process of meaning making, trying to understand those insights, trying to unpack what might lie beneath those insights. And that the entire process of integration is really rooted deeply in understanding of the experience that happened during dosing and integrating that further into patient's life. Unfortunately, there are a few properties of the psychedelic experience that make it very difficult to integrate. Right. One of them is the fact that the experience is ineffable. The reason why...
What's the word you're using
ineffable? It means that it's difficult to put into words.
Got you.
Which is why we don't understand the experience so well yet, because it's so hard to actually explain to someone what the experience is like unless they've experienced it themselves. Yeah. And even if they have experienced, even with the same substance, the same dose, in the same setting, their experience would still be different to your own. So it is a very difficult thing to put into words, and it is a very easy thing to forget. So the experience itself is very easily forgotten quite quickly. The insights are easily forgotten as well, except for maybe the main core messages that are being carried on. Right. But there's a lot of nuance, a lot of richness to the experience that can be very impactful, but it's just hard to hold on to that for a very long time. Even a few hours after the experience, it's quite easy to forget something that felt you were completely convinced of just a few hours earlier. Right. And something that was so clear and so obvious to you, suddenly, the next day, you can't bring it to your mind. What was it exactly?
So the risk here is that you reverse?
And not really reverse. I'd say the main risk is that you go through something that is challenging, through something that is very resource intensive, something that is very expensive very often.
Right. And like how much are we talking?
that's up to the clinics that are running in Melbourne to mention their price points. But it's definitely, a few $1,000s for just the dosing session.
Oh, wow. Okay.
So the full program, and I don't think anyone will be running just a dosing session, it's usually a full program, will be anywhere upwards from $20,000, $30,000 per patient.
Okay.
Yeah, so the risk is that we're going for all this trouble and then we're not actually maximizing the benefits that we could be getting from that treatment. There's also obviously a risk of lack of ongoing support for the patient because a lot of those programs have limited number of sessions, again, because of the cost.
Yep.
There is also something that patients sometimes refer to as having an open heart surgery and then surgeons walking away from the table, which is that you have this profound experience, all of those things come up. Some of the things that you might have not thought about for years or might not have been aware of at all before. And then you go through 3, 4, 5 sessions with your therapist. You still haven't processed that completely, and then you're left on your own.
Yeah, it's a bit like parenting. But.
So, fair enough. So this is the main risk, and this is something that we are trying to mitigate with the use of technology.
Yep.
And to take you through how we implement that within the psychedelic context, I'll have to kind of explain step by step how VR is being used. The most important thing to know is that we don't use VR in the way that most people are familiar with virtual reality being applied. It's not a mindfulness session. It's not an exposure scenario. It's not a replica of let's say, a therapist office or a cozy room, which are the most common uses of VR. It actually is a very, very simple space that is built by the patient himself. So what we provide the patients with are very simple building blocks within which they record the contents of their psychedelic experience, all those insights that we mentioned, in order for them to be able to return to them and process them further in the next sessions. So more specifically, how it looks like is that patients who have just had a psychedelic experience will use VR to project and express everything about that experience within the VR space. Predominantly, it is being used through the voice recordings. So patients will use different elements within the space to use as container for the voice messages that they have for themselves. Anything that comes up, any insights that they have, any narrative or story that emerged during their experience will be recorded within those objects. The objects are discrete. There is a whole range of them that are all separate to encourage patients to project their stories chaotically in those kind of separate little containers rather than trying to force a narrative. So that's kind of mitigating some of the patient complaints that have been recorded within research, which is that they're not really ready to tell the story of their psychedelic experience early on after the experience just unfolded because it's so hard to put into words and so hard to create anything that is cohesive. And so when they're faced with the therapist and they are expected to tell the story to the therapist, it's a very confronting thing to try to suddenly create a full narrative of that. But with those little containers within VR, they can project things as chaotically as they come. So every single thought or emotion or just a piece that comes to mind can be recorded within those separate little objects. And it is not during that time when they try to make any meaning of it. They just try to express as much as possible, and the meaning making comes in much later. So they have that permanent record of their experience that they can keep returning to. Obviously, with technology, we can save things forever. So that's a space that they can have for as long as they need, as the experience keeps unfolding for weeks or months after. And so they keep returning to that experience and listen back to those insights. They start mind mapping those insights by using different connections, symbols, themes, basically creating what is a mind map that is representing what's happening in their minds, in their hearts, onto that virtual space.
Okay. I think you did a marvellous job there of describing something which sounds really complicated. So let me just see if I've got the gist of it. Sounds like I've done my experience. I'm dealing with my PTSD or my significant trauma that I've just experienced in the past, and it keeps keeping me awake. I've gone through the psychedelic treatment, and now I'm putting on a helmet of some description.
A VR headset, yeah.
A VR headset, and I'm starting to vocalize what my experience was. And that as I'm vocalizing it, it's then starting to create some sort of digital landscape, which is storing or is converting those spoken words into some sort of memory, might be an object which I might be able to see or interact with, such that the box which I've placed over there in the corner might represent my relationship with my mum or something like that. Am I along the right track?
That's right, yeah. So these are multisensory projections which contain both visual and audio elements. And as you said, so that box might contain, if it's a large box, it might contain a whole range of different other symbols within that box that represent different parts of the relationship with your mom, because there's going to be so many elements to that. There's going to be some memories, there's going to be emotions associated with that, and each one of them can have its individual audio recording and a symbol that is assigned to that.
The voice component, you're suggesting symbols for me, or I go, well, I saw this vision of an angel on a donkey and I want to create a digital donkey with an angel on the back. Something, is that...
Yeah, so it is all patient-driven. So that's another thing that technology enables us. Instead of patients going to see a therapist who is expected to have a lot of answers and is expected to guide them through that process, a lot of what technology allows is to sort of flip that dynamic a little bit, which means that it's all patient-driven, patient-generated. All those records belong to the patient, first of all. And second of all, it's the patient who makes the decisions of how to represent them best and what the best next step would be. So we're putting the patient in driver's seat of that therapeutic process.
Why would you spend your time working on this? That's what I'm curious about. Because I can get the point. I can get the point that doing this experience is intense. It's really hard to capture. If you don't, you miss it effectively. Mm-hmm. It's profound, and true healing is going to come from not it just becoming a fleeting memory, but one which is kind of visceral and you can deal with. Mm-hmm. For you personally, why this space? That's what I'm curious on.
Almost anyone else would have said that they had a profound psychedelic experience and that made them really interested in this. For me, it's much simpler than that. It really all came down to data.
Right.
When I was studying psychology and I was searching for mental health treatments that are actually working, the only thing that actually came up that showed results that are reliable and that truly seemed to work was psychedelics. Even though the studies were very small at the time, it made so much sense to look into that in ways that could kind of represent my skill set as well. Because I was looking at that and I could see the huge benefit and the huge potential of psychedelics, but also a lot of those limitations that have been created by constantly repeating the same approach, which was sort of preemptively kind of designed initially when the first research on psychedelics happened, with that whole preparation integration component, with psychedelic session happening in a sort of living room-like environment with eye shades, and kind of perpetuating that idea of how the procedure itself should look like and how it should be integrated in the medical system in the way that is the easiest. So obviously, we can't blame the psychedelic practitioners for using the 60-minute weekly sessions to integrate psychedelic experience, even though we do know that by the time another week passes, there's a lot of that experience that is being forgotten, that the experience unfolds in ways that are far less predictable than that. You can't just expect someone to come to see a therapist and remember or reconnect to that experience. And we also know that it keeps unfolding for a very, very long time in very unexpected ways. And so looking at that, there were so many things that seemed obvious to me that could be changed to maximize those outcomes. As I mentioned, that ineffable richness, which is that difficulty to put into words. So I thought immediately of how can we represent that visually, but in a way that is permanent, in a way that we can keep coming back to and reshape and reform as that experience unfolds. So that was my interest, looking at it from a design perspective and looking at how can we make sure that we truly make the most of this treatment.
So a real efficacy piece, really.
Yes.
Like what actually works,
Yeah.
rather than just... Because we do seem to throw a lot of money at Band-Aid solutions in many different ways.
Yeah.
Who else is blazing a trail in this space globally?
There is a lot of research being done in the use of psychedelics for treatment of different conditions.
Right.
Obviously MAPS is the one to look at for the use of MDMA globally. The practitioners in Australia are also very often MAPS trained. So MAPS is kind of defining the golden standard for the use of MDMA for PTSD.
And so what was the name of it?
MAPS.
Just MAPS.
Multidisciplinary Association of Psychedelic Studies.
Okay. Got you. Can you just say that slowly, just so people who are taking an interest?
MAPS.
MAPS.
I think that's the easiest.
Okay, cool. MAPS Psychedelics. They'll find it on Google somewhere.
Yeah.
Okay, very cool.
And so there's also a lot of universities that look at different conditions and different applications of psychedelics. There's a whole range of new compounds that's being developed, and within the more business space, this is where the money is going into drug development. And this is something that Prash and I have a little bit of a problem with, because there's so many compounds that are being developed, but we still don't have a sustainable, reliable way of introducing them into the medical system without draining the most precious resource, which is the therapist's time, and is a limiting resource in terms of being able to introduce that at a larger scale. As I mentioned, the cost is huge, and the novel compounds are not going to resolve that problem. They might actually introduce new variables that we need to resolve with novel treatment approaches, which is something that we're looking at.
What do you mean the cost is huge? The cost of drug development is huge?
Well, it is, yes, it is as well, but the cost to the patient is huge. So it's obviously there's a lot of money that's going into drug development, but there's also a lot of money that patients need to pay for treatment. And that's not going to be resolved through novel drug compounds.
Got you. Interesting. So it sounds like drug companies are trying to trying to just keep the traditional business model of drug companies alive.
That's right.
Which is not actually about solving problems necessarily.
Don't quote me on that.
Maybe that's a perspective. Well, I think I think if we look at our medical system, it's largely about let's take hay fever treatment, right? Antihistamine doesn't solve your. It just dampens the symptoms, which is super helpful when you come to Melbourne, and the tree pollen is a nightmare. And I certainly am very grateful for the creative antihistamines, but it doesn't necessarily get to the real problem of why am I dealing with my pollen allergy, for example, right? So that's what I mean, not necessarily a huge takedown of the drug sector, although maybe that's a whole different conversation, Agnieszka, but I think that's what I mean about that. It's sometimes about masking symptoms, which produces a great output for the patient, in this case, my no runny nose when I'm doing a podcast, but it doesn't actually get to the root issue. Would that be fair? Or?
In a way. I mean, there's a lot of psychedelic compounds that are very interesting that are being developed. It's just that we already do have psychedelic compounds that work well, and we know that they work.
Right.
So we don't necessarily need new ones.
I'm with you.
And yet there's a lot of money going into that.
Let's shift gears a little bit. Your co-founder, Dr. Prash, I'll let you pronounce his surname in just a moment, but very well recognised on the AFR rich list for many years now. I think it's not just some people would have heard his name before. Interesting partnership between you two. How did that relationship and kind of partnership commence or start?
Again, through science. So Prash is.
Excuse me.
Prash is a medical doctor, and my background was in biomedical science when we met. He was interested in psychedelics for a very, very long time. For me, that interest was more in the altered state space more broadly, and in virtual reality. So I was always fascinated by how VR can hijack our sensory motor system and how it can induce certain states without... in a way that is very immediate, and without the user even often realizing what is happening in a way. So it's transforming you into this new environment, very reliably and within a single second. So I was always fascinated by how this could be applied within mental health. And when I met Prash, and he was fascinated with psychedelics, and he was really forging the path for the use of psychedelics in Australia, and that was years and years ago, before the TGA announcement, before psychedelics were cool, basically. And so there was this kind of, I guess, overlap in our interest to both innovate within mental health, recognizing that there isn't enough innovative mental health approaches, and also seeing the value in using altered states across the whole range of different indications. We started very slowly by just looking at different research and like different approaches within mental health that are innovative, reviewing some of that, writing some papers together, and that which sounds really boring. We're just basically that's what we did. We did research together within the space with no goal of really setting out to build a company together until we started to build our VR programs, and it was actually brought to us a number of times how valuable this could be. How that there is patentable aspect of it, and that this could be turned into business.
Yep.
And so with Prash's background, as you mentioned, he had a successful business in the past. We've decided to do this as a startup.
That's cool. What's your hope and aims for Enosis?
Oh, there are so many. We are very lucky.
I might rephrase that. What's the one thing you hope you achieve most?
Okay, can I have a couple?
All right.
I have a couple hopes.
You can have 2, 3.
We are very lucky that we just started partnerships with incredible partners in this space. I can mention a couple. One is Psychology Care, which is an amazing psychology clinic run by David Spector, who has done a lot of research in psychedelics. And so we are looking at running some trials together and starting this as an offering for patients.
Cool.
And another one is in Poland. It's a ketamine clinic. It's one of the largest ketamine clinics in Europe that introduced our system to integrate ketamine experiences with our VR. And we're also running research with them. So I think my biggest hope in there is that we work with people who are as committed as we are and have a similar aligned vision in making this treatment as scalable, as accessible as possible to as many people as possible, and as efficient as possible as well. And to just, do amazing research with them and provide that as a medical treatment to patients. And my other hope is for the part of the business that we haven't really discussed, which is as part of going through that experience, you create all those records of your experience, which obviously become data. And that data is very valuable to us because, as I also mentioned, a lot of the decisions in terms of how the treatment should proceed have been kind of done a little bit preemptively by a few individuals when the research first started. And I don't think we know enough about what that experience feels like and how it unfolds and how patients go through that process of healing. And so we are collecting all this qualitative rich data to be able to analyze that process and to really build those solutions bottom up. Yep. And so I hope that we're going to get as many users as possible, and we're going to be able to create as rich and responsive models that can be turned into like a feedback process for patients to really guide them on that experience and to show them what their individual experience is like and what they can do to maximize its benefits.
So it sounds like really building like an actual data set.
Yes.
Because that sounds like the missing gap, right? Because if you're having an experience, you can't put it into words, and you forget it 2 weeks later, and it's evolving and it's changing and it's deepening and it's broadening, then that's tricky. That's tricky to
that's right.
Especially for a researcher. I'm just thinking about most of the researchers I know. It's very binary. You're looking for that binariness in terms of ones and zeros. Doesn't it drive you bonkers, the level of kind of like no answer in this space, or the kind of the grey?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, this is also the beauty of this space. This is why we're so drawn to it. I don't think, within mental well-being, there aren't any binary answers, really, right. And we have to get used to that. I think psychedelics are kind of showing us that as well, that we need to be a little bit more flexible with our approach, that we need to rethink how we've designed the medical system altogether, that it's not as simple as just taking a pill and then going on your way, we need to provide a much more holistic support system. It's about the connection to nature. It's about connection to other people. It's about restoring those healthy habits. That is a little bit harder, and it's not as easy as taking a pill. But that's something that can actually create a sustainable change. So yes, it drives me crazy, but also it gives me hope that we will start to rethink how we approach treatment.
Yeah. Agnieszka, thank you so much for taking the time to talk to us. Thanks for putting up with my amateur hour questions over here as I navigate a very... I feel like I'm having a psychedelic experience trying to figure out what the hell's going on. So thank you so much for your time. It's been a real pleasure chatting with you.
Thank you. It was amazing to be here.